Ray guns, phasers, death rays. You know the drill. We've all seen them in the movies. These perfect, sleek beams of energy that just zap and the target is gone. But what happens when you try to build one in the real world? Well, let's just say it's less futuristic fantasy and a whole lot more of a brutal, knockdown, drag-out fight with the fundamental laws of physics.
And to get our heads around that fight, we've got to start with a question that sounds, well, a little weird. What does melting an ice cube have to do with a ray gun? I know, it sounds strange, but the answer is actually the key to understanding why building a real-life death ray is so incredibly, mind-bogglingly difficult.
Because when you boil it all down, these weapons are really about just one thing, delivering an overwhelming amount of energy to a target. The whole point is to heat something up so fast that it breaks or melts or just straight up turns into vapor. So yeah, let's get back to that ice cube.
Okay, check this out. Let's say we've got a 50-gram ice cube, couple of ounces, straight from the freezer. First, you need 2,100 joules just to get it to the melting point. But then, look at that next step. It takes a whopping 8 times that much energy, 16,700 joules, just to turn it from solid ice to liquid water without the temperature changing at all. Then you need another 21,000 to get it to a boil. But the final step, vaporization, that is the real energy monster. It demands a colossal 122,000 joules. So you add it all up and you get our grand total, 161,800 joules. That's the energy you need to completely annihilate one single pretty small ice cube. And here's the kicker. The phase changes, especially turning a liquid into a gas, eat up almost all the energy, like 75% of the total in this case. And that's just for water. Now imagine trying to do that to a sheet of steel.
And that right there is the fundamental job of any directed energy weapon. It's an energy delivery system, pure and simple. Its only purpose is to dump a massive amount of energy onto a target fast enough to cause it to catastrophically fail. So how do we actually try to pull that off? All right, let's look at our first contender, the laser. In sci-fi, this is the gold standard, right? But in the real world, a laser beam has a powerful, relentless enemy that it has to fight every single inch of the way to its target. And that enemy? It's the air itself. Yeah, we all picture lasers as these perfect, instantaneous lines of pure energy. But a real-world high-energy laser isn't just a beam of light. It's a beam of light desperately trying to punch its way through this thick soup of molecules and dust and water vapor that we all call the atmosphere. And this is where the trouble really starts. A laser's biggest problem isn't the armor on the target, it's just the air. The atmosphere is full of these tiny particles called aerosols, dust, water droplets, you name it. And when the size of those particles lines up just right with the laser's wavelength, they get incredibly good at scattering the beam's energy in every direction. Every single particle the beam hits is like a tiny little thief, stealing a bit of its power. Oh, but it gets so much worse. Certain molecules in the air, like water vapor and CO2, are basically tuned to absorb very specific wavelengths of light, draining even more of the beam's power. Then you've got something called thermal blooming. The laser literally heats up the air it's passing through, creating this little pocket of hot, less dense air that acts like a warped lens, making the beam spread out and lose its focus. And if you just try to brute force it with more power, the beam can actually rip the air apart, creating a little cloud of plasma that's completely opaque. It basically builds its own wall and can't go any further. So, okay, lasers clearly have some serious issues with the air. What about other options? Well, this brings us to microwaves. They're invisible, and because their wavelength is much longer, they have some pretty different properties and, you guessed it, some very different and very severe problems of their own. Microwaves are fundamentally the same stuff as light. They're both electromagnetic radiation, but their waves are way, way longer. And that gives them a really interesting advantage. They can pass right through things that are opaque to visible light. It's why your food gets hot in the microwave, but the ceramic plate usually stays pretty cool. The military idea here is to bypass the surface armor and just cook the delicate electronics inside a target. But microwaves have two absolutely fatal flaws. First, if you thought water was a problem for lasers, it is a complete catastrophe for microwaves. Water molecules are perfectly shaped to absorb microwave energy. That's great for reheating leftovers, but it means that humidity, fog, and especially rain can stop a microwave beam dead in its tracks. And second, and this is the real showstopper, air breakdown. The air turns into that beam-blocking plasma at power levels that are almost 4 orders of magnitude. That's 10,000 times lower than for a laser. Okay, so light and microwaves both get beat up by the atmosphere.
This leads us to our third and by far most exotic option, particle beams. Instead of firing waves of energy, these weapons fire actual streams of matter. We're talking electrons or protons at nearly the speed of light.
And on paper, these things seem like the perfect solution. Since they're firing actual particles with mass, they are essentially all-weather weapons. Rain, clouds, fog, it doesn't matter. They just punch right through it. Plus, these super high-energy particles don't just heat the surface, they penetrate deep inside a target, scrambling sensitive components from the inside out. I mean, it sounds totally unstoppable. So if a particle beam is the all-weather champion, if it just laughs at the atmosphere, what in the world could possibly be its weakness? The beam stops itself. Yep. In one of the cruelest ironies in all of physics, the very properties that make a particle beam so incredibly powerful are also what cause it to just tear itself apart in midair. It's a bizarre phenomenon with a great name, the sausage instability, and it's fascinating. It all starts with a tiny, random little bulge in the beam. The beam's own powerful magnetic field then overcorrects and squeezes the beam right behind the bulge. This creates a wave of these pushing and pulling forces that just get stronger and stronger as it travels, until the beam literally shreds itself into pieces, long before it ever reaches a target. So, what's the big takeaway here? Whether we're talking about a laser, a microwave, or a particle beam, they all slam headfirst into one ultimate, overwhelming challenge, and it's got nothing to do with the target. Let's just break it down. For lasers, the fight is against the atmosphere itself, just to heat a target's surface. For microwaves, the ultimate enemies are water and its own low threshold for air breakdown. And for particle beams, the challenge is fighting its own self-destructive nature. You see the pattern? Each weapon, in its own unique way, is defeated by the journey. And that is the absolute crucial point. The hardest part of building a directed energy weapon has never really been about generating enough power. We're actually pretty good at that. The true battlefield is propagation, that seemingly simple act of getting that energy from point A to point B without it getting scattered, absorbed, or just plain ripping itself apart along the way. This quote from the source material just sums up the whole field perfectly. It says, "The theoretical potential of particle beams as directed energy weapons is clear, but the experimental demonstration of that potential awaits advances in the state-of-the-art for particle accelerators." In other words, the idea is simple, the physics of making it actually work, that's the nightmare. Which leaves us with one last thing to think about. As we look to the future of these weapons, is the real challenge just building bigger, more powerful generators? Or is it about finding much, much smarter ways to win the battle of propagation, the physics of the journey itself? Because as it stands right now, the biggest threat to any ray gun is just the empty space between the weapon and its target.